Thank you, Your Honor.
How over did I go? Did I go too long?
Your Honor, counsel, members of the jury, good evening. Probably the only thing I agree with Mr. Diamond's attorney, Mr. Gentile, is to thank you for your kind attention, and that yes, the system of justice exists for the jury to reach a fair verdict based on the law and the facts. Based on the law, based on the facts as you find them to be. Not sympathy, not prejudice. This man over here is no longer a police officer. He is a civilian on trial for the most serious crime that you can be charged with in this state, murder in the first degree. Mr. Gentile talks to you about credibility issues. And he talks about a friendship between Beth Kelly and Trudy Doyle. And he refers to the interest of Mr. Diamond, perhaps, in evaluating his credibility. Interest in evaluating his credibility. When you examine the witnesses in this case after you recall their testimony and evaluate them, examine the witnesses insofar, I suggest to you, as to whether they're biased, whether they had a motive to lie, whether they're interested in the case, whether they were consistent, and their demeanor on the witness stand, and other such things that you use in your everyday life to judge whether somebody told you the truth when they testified under oath and whether they were accurate. And then you decide whether the defendant committed murder on December 1st, 1998, or oops, it was an accident. Because that's really what this case is about. It's only an accident, ladies and gentlemen, if you believe John Diamond, the man who was facing the most serious penalty the law can inflict. The undisputed facts in this case, and then judge whether Beth Kelly made up something 3 days later, or Sergeant Benbrook when he said the gun was cocked in his waistband, whether he, his fellow police officer, whether he had a motive to lie about the fact that the gun in his waistband was cocked, or whether he was wrong. He said it quite clearly. The gun was cocked. Examine Sergeant Benbrook. Did he have a bias, frank and forthright, consistent demeanor? Joseph Foster, and I'll get to him in a moment. The undisputed facts that we know of are that when he left the police station at 5:30 in the morning, or thereabouts, on December 1st, 1998, he left there with a loaded gun with a round in the chamber. The undisputed facts are that the gun has a recoil of about 15 degrees when you're shooting a gun in a police stance with two hands over it and you're ready for that gun to be fired. The undisputed facts are that this gun was fired 2 times. The undisputed facts are that this was not a hair trigger. You heard testimony on that in order to fire this gun, People's Number One, you had to pull the trigger with moderate force. I have a 6-year-old son. I submit, ladies and gentlemen, that in order for you to find reasonable doubt, the defendant not guilty in this case, you have to believe, number one, on November 27th, he took that gun that was a gift of Trudy Doyle's. It was no longer his off-duty gun, People's Number One. He took it, made sure the gun was unloaded, and he hid it. And he thereafter, after bringing Trudy home from the hospital, took that unloaded gun and put it in his police locker for 3 days. The testimony is that that unloaded gun, there's no testimony that he ever loaded it again, was put into his police locker and kept there. And we know that he didn't wear it as his off-duty gun or as a second gun on patrol, because he tells you that he took it out of the locker when he was cleaning it out. You have to believe, however, that as he hands in his resignation, and goes to the locker, his police locker, for the very last time, he deliberately loads the gun. He deliberately, which one? He deliberately packs his belongings. He deliberately puts the gun in his waistband out of habit. And he packs his, which one? And he packs his belongings in an airline bag. You have to believe that he takes this gun that somehow gets loaded, and out of habit, puts the gun in his waistband. Out of habit, that's what he told you. But you know what he also told you, ladies and gentlemen? His habit was that he used to wear that gun in a holster. Remember how Trudy used to try to snatch it out of his holster? The holster that was spring-loaded? But you have to believe that on December 1st, out of habit, he put that gun in his waistband. A gun which had been unloaded when it was in that locker. You have to believe that the gun was uncocked. You have to believe, ladies and gentlemen, that he thereafter went to the diner to see Trudy for one last time, just in case she wasn't going to go with him, or perhaps convince her to go along. And you have to then believe that Trudy, with cigarettes in her hand, took the gun. Now this, Mr. Gentile spoke a great deal about whether or not the cigarettes were in the right hand or the left hand. Now, could have been the left hand, could have been the right hand. I'm going to discuss with you why either situation makes the entire defense here totally implausible. But you know what you really know? You know they were in the right hand. Because of anything that Joseph Forster said, he certainly didn't recognize anything about cigarettes. Whether you believe 10 seconds or 5 seconds, you know what, ladies and gentlemen? I'm not suggesting for a moment that the two shots were 5 to 10 seconds apart. They weren't. And I don't think you have to believe Joseph Forster. Time can expand during a moment of excitement. But you got to listen to when he said it was in the right hand, and you look at that diagram. The diagram of the truck stop hotel. He didn't know there was any importance or any significance to the cigarettes. He had no reason to make this up or even recall it. Joseph Forster is sitting over here. Second seat removed from the cash register. There's a door open here. Mr. Diamond, closed. Mr. Diamond is standing here and he's 6 feet tall. And Trudy Doyle's in front of the cigarette machine. The only hand that Joseph Forster could have seen her holding cigarettes in would have been her right hand. Makes sense. And it's just no reason for him to make that up. Now, why is that important? Well, it's not of major significance, but Trudy was right-handed. Trudy was right-handed. So either she decides to throw the cigarettes down in front of her, contrary to what Mr. Gentile said, or she did the incredible acrobatic performance of using her left hand to snatch the gun. And you have to believe that she was able to snatch the gun, righty or lefty. You have to believe that this defendant didn't react. Now let's examine Mr. Diamond for a moment. He is not the ordinary person who appears before courts or even that you see in life. He is a medaled combat hero, veteran of the Gulf War. He's a trained police officer. He's a judo expert. He is a firearms expert. And he did not react. You got to believe this. You got to believe this if you want to believe him. That as she snatches the gun, he didn't react. You got to believe that as she undoes the safety, releases the safety of that gun, he doesn't react. You got to believe that as she cocks the gun, because he wants you to believe it was uncocked, he doesn't react. And if you want to believe for a second that there was no bullet in the chamber, and boy, if you believe him, I would suggest you have to believe that too, because why in the world would he chamber a bullet around? You have to believe she slid the slide back too, which he didn't even testify about. Because you have to believe all of that, and that he didn't react until she did all of that, and finally knocked the gun upwards, out of her hand. Only when you believe all of those things can you possibly consider his testimony as worthy of merit, and it is impossible. This self-defense expert, by the way, tells you that as the gun's pointed at him, he knocks it up out of her hand and catches it. Now let's talk about this. You, I, maybe that would be our initial reaction. But he's a trained judo expert, self-defense martial arts expert, in addition to all the other things. And it is pretty impressive. Firearms, military, medaled, combat veteran. What would be the first thing I would hope I would do if somebody's pointing a gun at me? I would try to get out of harm's way. Now, how do you do that? A trained judo expert knocks the gun away from pointing at him. Knocks the gun away from pointing at his death spots. What does he do? He goes up. If that gun accidentally goes off, he's a dead man. But that's what this trained judo, martial arts, self-defense, military hero does. Knocks it in a direction where if it had gone off with her finger on the trigger, he's a dead man. You and I might have done that. He would never, ever do that. It's impossible. It didn't happen that way. But what's more? What's more? So he didn't react like the expert he is. He knocks the gun up. Now what happens to the gun? Want to talk about physics, Mr. Gentile? The gun goes up. Now either he brushes the trigger this way, or somehow the gun flips around and he brushes the trigger this way. I don't know which way it happened. Didn't happen any which way. But let's assume for the moment we've got to consider this scenario. He brushes the trigger. Now what's happening? What's happening here? Examine the dynamics and the physics of the event. He's grabbing for the gun. He's grabbing for the gun. First of all, you have to believe that brushing the trigger would set it off, and we all know it takes a moderate trigger pull. It's not a hair trigger. So that's a lie. But let's say it's possible. He's grabbing for the gun. Well, if he just brushed it, if he just brushed the trigger as he's grabbing it, it's one movement. It's one movement. Had to be. That's what he said. How did his finger ever get in there? How did his finger ever get around the trigger to pull it a second time automatically after he tensed up? The only way is if his finger was in there the first time pulling the trigger. But he said that's not what happened. He denied that. He said, I brushed it and then automatically tensed. Impossible. Impossible to brush the trigger and fire it. And I suggest to you, you can't just brush the trigger as it's coming down and you're grabbing it. I don't care whether it's the awkward way or this way. And then get your finger in there a second time because you're just trying to grab it and get out of the way. It's impossible. Then we want to talk about bullet wounds. Remember, 15-degree recoil if you're like this and you're a police officer firing that gun in a firing range. But if you're not ready for something, you know, ladies and gentlemen, if one of you came up to me, I'm not suggesting that you do now, you're jurors. One of you came up to me, and I said, I'm going to push you, like I'm going to fire the gun. I'm going to push you hard. Well, maybe you'll take one step back, 15-degree recoil. But if I push you when you're not ready, when you're relaxed, boom, you could fall down or go back 10 feet because you're not ready for that 15-degree recoil. He wasn't ready for a 15-degree recoil if you believe him. So what's going to happen no matter how he fires this gun, this way or this way, accidentally, the gun's going to go bam, recoil. How did he get a second shot off like that automatically tensing? Or bam! How did he get a second shot off automatically tensing? No way. The way you get a second shot off, ladies and gentlemen, is you go bam, bam. Direction of the bullet wounds. Mr. Gentile, I respectfully have to disagree with you about the laws of physics as they apply, not the laws of physics, but how they apply to this case. You got the shots all wrong. The first shot, ladies and gentlemen, the first shot in this case is not the one that goes through her wrist. And you know, talking about Beth Kelly, Beth Kelly had no reason. Oh, I want to say one other thing about Beth Kelly. You heard Mr. Gentile make a big production out of the fact that the first person to recount the events of this day to the police that were recorded was the defendant. That's not true. That's not true. you heard from Sergeant Benbrook that while he didn't get a written signed statement from Beth Kelly till some days later, he spoke to her right there as he's sitting in the car, calm, cool, and collected, not even looking at his dead loved one. And he's taking a statement from Beth Kelly, and he recorded it. He put it in notes, and then you heard he put it in the DD-5, the detective's report. That morning, before he ever had a chance to make up his story. But what else do you know about what Beth Kelly tells you? Bullet wounds. She had no reason to lie, no reason to make this up. She tells you, and said it 3 days later when she's interviewed at length, that I hear a shot. I hear Trudy scream and put her hand over her heart. If I may use your diagram, counsel. Heard her shot, and I heard her put her hand over her heart. She puts her hand over this shot on the left side, over her heart, then gets shot through the wrist where there are fragments of the bracelet found right there, point number 3 as it's indicated in the chart. So the first shot, and by the way, she didn't know there were fragments of metal similar of kind to the same bracelet that Trudy was wearing when she was killed. She didn't know that there were fragments of metal found on the right side of Trudy's chest. But the only explanation that makes sense is that Beth Kelly was telling the truth and was accurate when he says, I heard a shot, there was a scream, I see Trudy throw her hand over her heart, which is exactly where you'd see Trudy throw her hand if she was shot over here. And then I heard a second shot, which amazingly contains metal fragments, exactly where you'd see Trudy throw her hand if she was shot over here. And then I heard a second shot, which amazingly contains metal fragments from her bracelet, just as Trudy would have described. Mr. Gentile, with all due respect, that's how it happened. Excuse me. Now, let's talk about the bullet directions. Let's talk about the bullet directions. John Diamond pulls a gun. What does Trudy do? Trudy turns to the right, to avoid being shot. She gets shot, just as the bullet wounds show you. She's in close quarters. Boom. Oh, by the way, I'll agree with you on the laws of physics. As soon as that shot hits her like that, she's thrown back, hand over heart, and then she's shot again, which is why the bullet wound on the right side of her chest, the one with the bracelet, is straight through her body, not going left to right. That's what happens here, ladies and gentlemen. Now, you heard Estelle Mason testify on behalf of the defendant, and Mr. Gentile talks about the seconds, and I'll tell you the truth. I agree. It didn't happen in 5 to 10 seconds between shots. But Estelle Mason tells you it happened between 1 and 2 seconds. And I suggest you can accept that. And by accepting that, as they would have you believe, you got to convict the defendant of murder. We'll get to that in a little while. But think about 1 to 2 seconds. Excuse me one moment. By the way, do you really think it's unusual for your former partner, Sergeant Manad, former partner of a police officer, to come forward on behalf of the defendant and say what a great guy he was when he was working with him? I heard some of that from defense counsel. Do you really think that's unusual? A brother police officer comes forward to testify on your behalf? Now, you got to believe, we're still on Mr. Diamond's story, you got to believe that after this incredible series of events, where the person he fell in love with immediately, the person he's living with, the person he wants to marry, the person he dreams about taking to California, the person just got killed, bloody all over in front of his eyes accidentally, that he's calm, cool, collected, he shows no emotion whatsoever. But not right then at the scene as he's holding her hand. He's sitting in the car. Now he's watching the situation as Sergeant Benbrook is interviewing Beth Kelly. He still shows no emotion. He's calm, cool, and collected. And in fact, he never even looks at this woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. Then you got to believe this. 8 hours later, 8 hours later, without deliberation, because he didn't deliberate this crime, it was an accident. All of these things happen. He's calm, cool, and collected, and he makes a statement to the police, which, by the way, withdrawn. He makes a statement to the police. And he says, and I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, on this alone, on this statement alone, you can convict John Diamond of premeditated murder. I didn't want her to leave without at least asking her one last time to come with me, and to say goodbye if she refused. I got up quickly, hurrying to the front door. When I got there, she was in the entrance vestibule, not about to leave, but merely using the cigarette machine there. Now listen to this. Here's a guy that just lost his loved one. He wants you to believe that he's in shock, that he's not calm, cool, and collected. That's why he doesn't react in any way. He's too shocked. He's not thinking. He's telling it as it is. Quote, "This vestibule was between the door to the street and another door leading into the restaurant area itself. This latter door was glass and shut behind me, so I doubt anyone could hear what was being said. Also, my back was to it, so anyone looking in would have a hard time seeing what was happening." Are those the thoughts and details you would recount in expressing the accidental killing? Or are those the thoughts and details that you would deliberately know to say because in planning the killing, you would remember that you have to kill her in a place that's open in plain sight, but where there's no real witnesses? That deliberation is not the product of someone who accidentally just was involved in a tragic event, losing the woman of your dreams, such that you would remember to recall those details of the event to the police 8 hours later. Those are the thoughts of a deliberate planner who knows to say that, but shows the operation of his mind when he did in fact plan the murder. He knew that vestibule was half wood. He knew he was a big man. He knew nobody could see. And he knew nobody could hear. That's what those words tell you. They tell you, I deliberately planned this killing. And then, this is unbelievable. Lo and behold, you got to believe that as this gun is spinning and he's brushing, he's tensing and he's shooting, these shots go boom, 2 of them, death blows through her chest. Who is John Diamond? Who is Trudy Doyle? John Diamond is a man who had a terrible divorce, still involved in it. Kids are living with his wife. But he fell in love. He fell in love. And within days, weeks, he's ready to marry this woman, Trudy Doyle. He proposed marriage to her. And he's leaving the job of his dreams, a police officer, to move 3,000 miles away. He's leaving the children he claims to have loved. He's leaving the job of his dreams, and he's moving 3,000 miles to California with a woman who he'd just fallen in love with. And as you will recall, you'll recall, his friend, Sergeant Manning, told you, when he met Trudy, his life changed. He was a happy man. He was excited. He was looking forward to life again. What does it tell you about what the defendant was before he met Trudy Doyle? What does it tell you about his state of mind must have been when Trudy Doyle crushed him by not wanting to go to California? Because you got to remember, Trudy Doyle, she's going through a divorce, but her child is living with her mother. She loves him. She speaks about him all the time. She's got a good job, and she's put her life together. And she's reluctant. She's unsure of her feelings towards this man. She's reluctant. So while she has completely changed his attitude towards life and he dreams of this new life in California, Trudy is hesitant, and she hasn't said yes. Can you imagine what the frustration must have been for this defendant? So what happened? This is a disappointed man, ladies and gentlemen. He knows even as recently as 3 days before he kills her, she may very well not leave with him to start this new life. What is he going to do? What is he going to do? Well, if anybody's going to kill you, I will. It's pent up. He's the man he was before. And you can surmise, ladies and gentlemen, it's a fair inference to draw based on what Sergeant Madden, his own friend, told you, what he must have been going through and felt like if he thought this woman wasn't going to go with her. It must have been a crushing blow. And think about what must have been going on as he's sitting in there in that diner that morning for 30 minutes. Trudy doesn't even talk to him or look at him, take note of him. This man whose whole life he's now built, this man who's built his whole life about her. He's sitting there, he's stewing, and he's further deliberating. What happens? What happens? If you don't believe this nonsense that you heard from the defendant, this incredible series of acts, which don't even line up with the physical evidence or any of the witnesses, what happens? The morning of December 1st, he is going to give her one night last shot, maybe. But if she ain't going with him, he's going to kill her. He's going to kill her. How do we know this? How do we know this? Because his acts show deliberation. He goes to that police locker, puts his personal belongings in an airline bag. It's a day like no other. It's a day like no other. He leaves all of his police equipment in that locker. He loads that Mauser. He has to have loaded the Mauser because he brought it there unloaded and it stayed there for the last 3 days. So he deliberately loads the Mauser. Not out of habit, because it wasn't his habit to have that Mauser anymore. He gave it to Trudy as a gift. He deliberately loads the Mauser and had to have chambered a round, getting ready to fire it, because he even tells you, under his story, Trudy never chambered a round. That's the only way, you know, the operation of the gun, to fire this gun. He deliberately chambers a round, he deliberately loads the gun, and then he deliberately doesn't put it in what was his habitual method of carrying the gun when he did do it. He doesn't put it in his waist holster that has a spring device to hold it in so that you can't rip it out of a police officer's person that easily. He deliberately puts it in his waistband for quick access. Deliberately. And then he cocks the gun. Now, if you want to go into a vestibule where you know you can't be seen and you know you can't be heard and you're a cop and want to get away with a murder, the one thing you know you have to do is you have to do it as quickly as you can and as completely as you can. Because if the victim survives, you're not going to get away with that murder because this whole story ain't ever going to be told. And you go to that diner, pent up, thinking, hoping against hope, but really knowing the truth. She ain't going with you. And you sit there in that diner, and she chats and talks and smokes with her friends. She snubs her nose at you, Mr. Diamond. You sit in that booth, and she never comes over, and she never smiles, and she never even says hello. And now, you don't walk for 30 minutes, despite the fact that you're going to California, and you want to know, you want to resolve this. You don't bother to walk up to her. Not for 30 minutes does he walk up to Trudy. He waits until she goes into that vestibule, and then he rushes over there. Now, diagram, please. I've got it. He goes into that vestibule, and Trudy Doyle is at the cigarette machine, and he's a big man, and he runs to make sure he gets to that vestibule. And he opens the door, and he doesn't open the door, and it opens to the inside. So he doesn't just go open it and say, Trudy, I've got to talk to you. He steps in and makes sure that door closes. See, if it opened into the diner, it closed automatically. But he has to make sure. Why not? I mean, it's perfectly normal. He's rushing. The first, you'd be blurting out words to catch her if he's rushing. And he said he's rushing. He's running in there. He opens the door, and he doesn't talk. He waits until he clears that door. And it shuts behind him. And that only shows one thing, ladies and gentlemen, deliberation. He thought about what he was doing, just like he told the cops. He knew exactly what to do. Block their view, block their ears. And then he did exactly what Estelle Mason tells you. Estelle Mason? Yeah. 1 to 2 seconds between shots. What had to have happened? You know, if you believe him, you have to acquit him because it was an accident. Okay? That's ridiculous. What happened? There's only one explanation that matches the testimony and the physical evidence. He pulls his gun. Do you remember what Beth told you, Beth Kelly? The only thing she sees, I think it's Beth Kelly, is that Trudy Doyle walks towards the defendant. Now, they would have you believe somehow that she's going towards the defendant, but you know what? She shakes her head no. She's getting back in the diner, and this guy's blocking her. That's why when you hear that description that he's going towards the defendant, she's going into the diner. No, I'm not going with you. No, leave me alone. No, it's over. I'm going back in the diner. But he blocks her path, and what does he do? He makes the jerking motion. Not Trudy, him. There's none of this description of any actions by Trudy making any kind of reaching motions with her hand. He jerks, and that's their witness that tells you it. I think it was Estelle. And what happens? What happens? It was Estelle. If anybody's going to kill you, I will. 2 seconds. Well, ladies and gentlemen, him, because if you tense up, it's immediate. It's a muscular reaction. But when you do plan to kill somebody, and it's premeditated, and you want to get it done, and it took 1 to 2 seconds, that's not automatic. Bang, bang. That is not brushing the trigger and then tensing up. Bang, 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 bang. And what did Trudy do? Bang, bang. It's the only explanation. The only explanation that fits the facts, ladies and gentlemen. You know, despite all your differences, you all share your common sense and your logic. And I ask you to utilize that in the jury room. Listen to what you've heard, deliberate, and bring back the only verdict that speaks the truth in this case. Murder in the first degree, guilty. Thank you.